Welcome back to Smarter Markets at IETA's North America Climate Summit 2024. I'm here with David Antonioli, owner of Transition Finance. Great to see you, David.
Yeah, good to see you.
Thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me back. It's a pleasure.
Well, I was really looking forward to catching up. I wanted to ask you, with Transition Finance, what are you working on?
Yeah. Well, I spent the last year basically thinking and reflecting on the carbon markets. And I put together a report about how, basically setting out my reflections and my thoughts. But basically, the main message is that we can and should be using carbon finance as a driver and a catalyst to enable the kinds of transitions the world really needs. And quite frankly, I don't think we're right there. I think the carbon market right now kind of is very focused on generating a ton of carbon for some sort of compensatory claim, which is okay. But that means that the only discussion we're having in carbon markets is, are we achieving a ton of carbon? And I think we need to balance that out with a theory of change around what it is that we're using with the finance that's being delivered to enable the kinds of economic transitions that the world really needs, to reduce costs, to build distribution and maintenance networks, to de-risk future investments in these technologies and practices. And so I think there's some work that we need to do to enable those kinds of transitions, and that's what I've been working on and trying to put together some ideas and some concrete proposals for how we do that.
And so when you come to a conference like this one, do you feel like those conversations are getting on the agenda, or are you trying to put them on the agenda?
I'm trying to put them on the agenda. Quite frankly, I don't think the market has broadly thought about this question. What drove it was this question. It was kind of one of those, wake up in the middle of the night, like wondering, what are we doing here? And the concern I have is, what's the plan for when the party ends? And what I mean by that is, like, when the last carbon credit is issued and sold, what then? How do we know that the activities that we've been financing through the sale of carbon credits actually generate some sort of long-term economic or structural transition or framework that enables those technologies or practices to keep going without the need for carbon finance? So that's a real big worry. And so when I come to conferences like this, I'm putting it on the agenda, and it is a bit uncomfortable. Quite frankly, I get people who say, well, it's a good question, but let's work on that later. We can work on that later. I get others who say, like, well, it's not my problem. And others who say, well, today I sell carbon credits, tomorrow I can sell biodiversity credits. I don't think that's a robust enough answer. And I actually think that we have a responsibility to really make sure that we're using this limited finance to drive those kinds of transitions. But then if we do, I think that opens up a whole different debate and narrative about what this market is about and what we're trying to achieve.
And I know the word transition gets used so much, and it's so important. When you think about the sorts of finance that you want to get into this transition, could you give an example of what would be that transition to a more sustainable?
Sure. I'll give you two examples. Let's take regenerative agriculture, right? We know that a farmer today isn't very likely to do regenerative agriculture because it's risky, yields will go down, doesn't really know the future. So they're very hesitant to make that transition. Now, we know over time, though, that regenerative agriculture makes sense, right? Your yields come back, your revenues are diversified, your farm is much more better protected against floods and droughts. So it's a good thing in the long term. But you need something to get over that valley, if you will. Well, why don't we use carbon as a way to get to that transition? Because today, when a farmer goes to a local bank officer and says, hey, can I borrow some money to do some regenerative agriculture? The bank's going to look at him like he's crazy, right? And that makes sense because we haven't done enough. We haven't gotten enough farmers to do it. We haven't de-risked the proposition. But if we get enough farmers, and the idea here is, imagine if we had a different additionality test. And we said, look, why don't we actually approve regenerative agricultural practices, which we know are not happening, up until we reach a certain percentage threshold of market penetration. And we can study this and understand what that looks like. Let's just say it's 16%. And until we reach 16%, all regenerative agricultural practices are approved. Now, we flip the debate, or we flip the concept, right? Now, investors say, wait a minute, I can actually build a business on promoting and getting regenerative agricultural practices in place. I can bet at scale.
Right.
And now, what we do is actually we get that activity, we get to 16%, and if we do achieve that tipping point, well, guess what? We get 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 and 60% transition. We get huge amounts of benefits from a climate change perspective. And so we've transitioned that market, but we've used carbon finance in a thoughtful way. But the key is that we need to streamline the approval process, going back to kind of additionality. Right. But we also need to set a framework or a threshold at which we no longer issue credits to new projects, right, which we've seen is really challenging. If you don't set some forward curve, if you will, then people are shooting in the dark. And there's always this nervous factor about like, when's the next project that's going to get rejected, just like happened in renewables. We need to be forward-looking and set out a framework that identifies when carbon crediting is no longer appropriate. And then you let the market operate at scale with investment, and then investors can make big bets. So that's the idea of using finance to kind of get over that hump. And if you do that, then the farmer that goes to the local bank, right, says, can I get a loan to do some regenerative agriculture? The bank officer says, yeah, sure. I've seen David does it, and Joe does it, and Mary does it, and all the farmers around here are doing it. Hey, the farms are in better position, right? They handled that last drought much better, right? So then it becomes a business opportunity. And that, to me, is where I think we need to go, and something that's really exciting about how we can use these markets to drive those kinds of transitions.
Yeah, that type of catalytic financing sounds really interesting to get you over that hump, exactly, as you put it, that's so difficult. And then this other piece you brought up about, almost like having a clock running on the additionality piece that, okay, we're going to need the financing until we get through that early adoption phase and you get past the tipping point. You spent a lot of time at Vera, you were the CEO. How do you think we need to adjust the way we think about the methodologies, the way we think about carbon markets to allow for that type of approach?
It's a great question. So I think that, fundamentally, we need to reconsider the tool that we mostly use to approve projects, and that's the additionality tool. Mm. And quite frankly, I think the additionality tool has a lot of problems. And the additionality tool is like a test that you can take multiple times. And I'll bet you by the third time you take a test, you get 100. And so there's this constant back and forth that goes between the developer and the auditor and the developer and the standards body. And it's a lot of work. And quite frankly, I don't think it gets you that much integrity at the end of the day than if you just identified the activities that we know are not happening but are beneficial for the climate. Let's put those on a positive list. This has been done before. So think about California. California said, look, here are I think there's 7 activities that they've determined are additional a priori, and those get approved. Now, what California has not done is establish the point at which you no longer approve new projects, and that's where the key is. Right. If we can find the appropriate threshold for those activities that have some sort of economic benefit, I think that's the key. Now, the other part to it is that carbon markets have been kind of trained to look at anything with an economic opportunity with extreme suspicion, because it may not be additional. Well, actually, I think we're tying our hands behind our back, because this is a race to try to get the new businesses. And I think carbon, the businesses of the future, I think carbon can do that. Now, there's other kinds of projects that don't have an economic rationale, like landfill gas capture and destruction, industrial emissions, even conservation of forests, don't have long-term economic value. So we need to think about mechanisms that ensure that those activities keep going, such as creating trust funds, for example, or getting government commitments. But we need to solve for that question, because if we don't, I do fear that we might end up implementing a lot of cool projects, but when the party ends, it's all going to come crashing down. And actually, it feeds into the criticism, right? A lot of people argue that these markets are a distraction. And if we don't solve for this, I actually believe that they may have a point. So I think it's incumbent upon us that we really think about what the end game looks like to ensure that we're using this limited source of finance in a thoughtful and productive way.
Yeah, and clearly people have been looking for the direction for the voluntary carbon markets and the carbon markets broadly. And you've got, a lot of people who think, probably the end stage is you get to compliance regimes. Maybe the voluntary carbon markets continue to exist. Maybe they don't. Maybe they get incorporated. Lots of different views. I'm curious, when you step back, you have the path that you would like them to go, focusing on transition finance. are there, how do you see things developing if it doesn't go down that path? Do you see alternatives, or do you think this is the ticket?
I think I'd be very worried, quite frankly, if we don't figure this out. And you mentioned kind of the difference voluntary versus compliance. I actually came to this conclusion from a compliance experience, right? So I developed landfill gas projects when I was working under the CDM. I led a joint venture. We developed projects all over the world. And it turns out that the projects that had an economic rationale, the ones that generate electricity, those are operating fine. They have a power purchase agreement and they're fine. And that was a great technology to get going. But most of the projects that just captured and destroyed landfill gas, they're all mothballed. There's expensive equipment on the ground. The pipes that we installed are getting rotting. The technicians we trained are working elsewhere. And I find that that's a missed opportunity. So what do we achieve? We achieve some high integrity credits that some company in Europe used to meet their target. That's fine. But it goes back to my theory of change. If you think about the theory of change of carbon markets, right now it's only limited to the buyer side. So it's about create a ton of carbon, enable a company to buy it, right? And by pricing that carbon, they now have some sort of internal price on carbon, and that drives internal reductions. That's fine. But we're missing a whole other part of the puzzle, which is what are we doing with that finance to make sure that it keeps going? In that project, there was an expectation that governments were going to step up. And there, in fact, many of those projects were in places where there was a government regulation. It just wasn't enforced. Well, maybe going forward, we should be asking, look, if we're going to invest in this project, will you, government, make the commitment to regulate or to keep that project going once it ends? And I think that changes the dynamic. We're really, we can't be spending money on expensive pieces of equipment that are just going to end up lying on the ground. So we really need to be using this finance to create, momentum and pressure. In this case, pressure on government. But in the case of a government commitment, why don't you create a trust fund that gets funded over the course of the project that enables the government to keep that project going when it's really just OpEx at that point, right? But we have to think through what that looks like and frame it and design the market to enable that. If not, I do fear that we are going to be spinning our wheels. We'll look back in 20 years and say, what did we do? A bunch of good stuff, but it didn't reach the scale or didn't enable that long-term transition.
And I wanted to ask you about scale. Like when you think about the projects that would fall into that category of, it's costly to transition, but once you've transitioned, they have the ability to pay for themselves. How much scale do you think there could be or is currently in those types of projects?
So that's a great question. So one of the things I'd like to do is actually get some resources to do proper academic studies to identify what's, for example, the market penetration threshold you need to transition a sector. Now, there's some really interesting research on this, right? So Everett Rogers, an American sociologist, he studied how American farmers adopted new corn seed. And he and subsequent research have kind of identified, you've heard the term entrepreneurs, early adopters, early majority, late majority. That comes from a lot of that research that essentially created the S-curve of adoption, which is what we're trying to achieve. But one piece of research subsequent to that identified that the chasm is at 16% market penetration. So that's the point where if you don't get there, you kind of fall back down the curve, right? But once you cross that bridge, that chasm, then you're off to the races. So maybe that's just a theoretical point of view, but we need to understand that. But I think we need to we need to kind of unpack, and there's loads of studies that have looked at this, right? You go to business schools, these guys study this all the time. Products get introduced to markets all the time. They get subsidized, cross-subsidized, whatever, and then they take hold. So I think for these activities where we believe that there's a long-term economic value, let's invest, let's allow the market to make those investments so that we bring down the cost, build the distribution maintenance networks, provide the training that everybody needs to make the transition, and essentially de-risk future investments so that they can stand on their own without carbon finance.
Well, thanks so much for talking with us about transition finance. Before you go, I wanted to ask you one last question, which is, what are you going to be watching over the next year? What development or potential developments in the carbon markets do you think would be the most important for us all to keep our eyes on?
Well, I think there's a lot of work that's happening. There's a great work that's happening to kind of streamline and bring credibility to the supply side of the market. So the ICVCM, I think the work is really important. I think the ICVCM can have a really big impact in bringing some confidence back to the market. I would I hope that the ICVCM has the ability to think forward and think about what the future market looks like. Right now, they're kind of solving kind of the legacy issues, and that's great. But I look forward to seeing what the ICVCM comes up with, potentially with kind of incorporating this kind of thinking of kind of ultimately what are we trying to achieve and embedding that into the rules. And then of course you've got the VCMI, who are looking at it from the demand side. I think those two are really critical. If we can bring some kind of legitimacy and credibility back to the market as it is, to be able to create credible tons as well as credible claims, that's really important. But I do think that there's still, even if we are able to achieve that, there's still this extra element that I think is really critical, which making sure we design the market to enable the kinds of transitions the world needs.
Terrific. Thanks, David.
Yeah.
It's great to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Absolutely. Yeah.